Back in the day, our grandparents knew how to stretch $1 and fill a belly. They didn't need fancy ingredients or gourmet kitchens, just a little creativity, grit, and whatever was in the pantry. So these are 25 poor man meals that faded from grandparents' table. Long before plant-based eating was trendy, families were already crafting meatless meals that could satisfy even the hungriest crew. One such dish, bean and bread patties, made frequent appearances on Depression-era tables, not out of dietary preference, but out of sheer necessity. These patties were a prime example of kitchen ingenuity, blending leftover beans and stale bread into a hearty, pan-fried meal that stretched limited groceries far beyond their expected shelf life. During lean times, especially throughout the 1930s and 1940s, wasting food was simply not an option. Even crusty bread ends found second life, mashed into softened beans, seasoned with onions or herbs when available, and fried to a crisp in lard or leftover bacon grease. The result? A savory patty that packed protein, filled the belly, and cost mere pennies to make. They didn't need to look pretty, just hold together long enough to get from skillet to plate. As one grandmother reportedly said, "If it doesn't fall apart, it wasn't made right." It was meals like this that taught resourcefulness in every bite and made full use of pantry scraps, proving flavor didn't need a big budget. When budgets were tight and dinner had to come from whatever was in the pantry, few dishes offered the same comfort and convenience as creamed peas on toast. This humble meal became a regular fixture in American kitchens, especially during the Great Depression and wartime rationing. Canned peas, cheap, shelf-stable, and widely available, paired with a basic white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, could transform yesterday's bread into something that actually felt like a meal. It wasn't fancy, but that was the point. Toast, often made from the day-old loaf that was too dry for sandwiches, became the perfect base. The sauce stretched the peas just far enough to feed a family, and a pinch of salt and pepper gave it enough flavor to keep complaints to a minimum. Well, most of the time. As some kids joked, "Creamed peas again? Must be Wednesday." In truth, dishes like this were all about maximizing what was on hand. Rather than toss out stale bread or wait for fresh vegetables, families made do and made it work. The meal's simplicity masked its real strength, the ability to stretch limited ingredients into something warm, filling, and economical. During the leanest decades of the 20th century, resourcefulness in the kitchen wasn't just admired, it was expected. That's how liver loaf earned its place at the table. Organ meats like liver were inexpensive, packed with nutrients, and widely available at butcher shops, making them a practical choice for families looking to stretch their food budgets without sacrificing nutrition. Turning liver into a loaf wasn't just a culinary choice, it was a financial strategy. Ground liver was blended with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and sometimes a splash of milk, whatever was on hand, to create a dense, sliceable loaf. It resembled meatloaf in appearance, but had a distinct flavor that earned strong opinions in both directions. Some called it hearty, others politely passed it to the dog under the table. Either way, it got eaten. In terms of nutrition, liver loaf punched well above its weight, rich in iron, vitamin A, and protein at a time when supplements weren't sitting in everyone's medicine cabinet. And let's not forget the no-waste mentality. Using every part of the animal was standard practice, not an ethical trend. Families made it work because they had to, not because they wanted a cooking challenge. In Southern kitchens, a can of tomatoes and a bit of flour could go a long way. That's where tomato gravy and biscuits came in, a dish that made the most of simple staples when meat was scarce and money was even scarcer. Born out of the Great Depression and carried through hard times in rural America, this meal represented both necessity and culinary creativity, turning pantry basics into a filling breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The gravy was typically made by cooking down canned or fresh tomatoes with bacon grease or lard, then thickened with flour and water or milk. It was poured generously over biscuits, usually made from scratch using flour, lard, and buttermilk. Nothing went to waste. Leftover biscuits from the day before were often reheated and revived under a ladle of warm, tangy sauce. It wasn't meant to impress guests, but it sure impressed empty stomachs. In fact, the acidity of the tomatoes helped cut through the richness of the fat, creating a balance that kept folks coming back, even if it was the third time that week. Tomato gravy and biscuits taught generations that a humble meal could still be hearty, honest, and deeply satisfying. At a time when the average household had to stretch every meal across days, not just hours, families learned to transform even the humblest scraps into something worth sitting down for. That's how bread and onion stuffing patties became a beloved standby. Originally a clever way to repurpose leftover stuffing from a holiday roast, these patties evolved into a standalone dish in kitchens that didn't always have meat to go with them. Using day-old bread, chopped onions, herbs, and whatever drippings or fat were available, home cooks shaped the mixture into small cakes and pan-fried them until golden. They were crisp on the outside, soft in the middle, and inexpensive enough to make in large batches. In some households, they were served with gravy, if any was left, or even a splash of vinegar for tang. The real genius of the dish lay in its simplicity. Onions were among the cheapest vegetables on the market, and bread was rarely wasted even when stale. Together, they offered flavor, texture, and enough substance to hold off hunger. Despite the frugal roots, bread and onion stuffing patties reflected a mindset where waste was unthinkable and where turning nothing much into something good wasn't a trick, it was a way of life. In the heart of the Great Depression, when pantries were bare and wallets were even emptier, home bakers got inventive in ways most modern cooks wouldn't dare attempt. Boiled water pie was one of those creations, a dessert made not with luxury, but with logic. Sugar, flour, butter, and water formed the base, and a bit of vanilla gave it just enough character to make folks forget it was essentially a pie made with hot water and hope. This wasn't a flaky, fruit-filled pastry to impress the neighbors. It was a triumph of ingenuity, born from empty cupboards and an unwavering desire to serve something sweet at the end of a hard day. The filling, thickened with flour and set in a basic pie crust, created a gelatinous texture, almost like a custard's frugal cousin. If there was no butter, lard worked. No vanilla? A pinch of cinnamon did the trick. Despite its simplicity, boiled water pie became a symbol of doing more with less. It used no eggs, no milk, and no exotic ingredients, just the bare bones of a dessert and a good deal of perseverance. This pie stood as quiet proof that even during the leanest seasons, people still found ways to sweeten life, one slice at a time. When refrigeration was unreliable and grocery runs weren't guaranteed, families leaned on ingredients that could last for weeks or even months without spoiling. That's how salt pork and potato stew found its way into so many cast-iron pots across America. Salt pork, a cured cut of fatty meat, was cheap, shelf-stable, and added flavor to even the blandest of meals. Combined with hearty potatoes, onions, and water, it created a stew that could feed a whole family without breaking the bank. The key to this dish wasn't extravagance, it was economy. Salt pork could be rendered for its fat, browned for texture, and used sparingly to add depth to a meal otherwise dominated by starch. Potatoes, the workhorse of the poor man's pantry, offered bulk and nourishment, and were often grown right in the backyard. In some versions, a carrot or two might sneak in, but for many families, this stew relied on whatever root vegetables hadn't gone soft yet. Waste wasn't an option. Leftover broth could be saved and reused as the base for another day's meal. Though salt pork and potato stew isn't a regular on today's dinner tables, it once served as a practical solution to hunger, using preserved meat and humble vegetables to stretch both flavor and resources, one ladle at a time. In households where meat was a rare luxury and leftovers were a way of life, nothing went to waste, not even the morning oatmeal. That's where oatmeal patties entered the picture. Made from leftover cooked oats, a few beaten eggs, breadcrumbs, and whatever seasonings were within arm's reach, these patties turned a humble breakfast item into a surprisingly satisfying dinner or side dish. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Oats were, and still are, one of the most affordable pantry staples. They store well, cook fast, and offer fiber and protein without the price tag of meat or dairy. By the mid-20th century, many frugal families learned to repurpose them creatively. Frying leftover oatmeal into patties not only stretched resources, but also added texture and flavor to a meal that might otherwise feel one-note. Often pan-fried in bacon drippings or lard, the patties were crisp on the outside, soft inside, and frequently served with gravy or a splash of ketchup. Some versions even added grated onion or cheese when available, making the dish slightly more decadent, by Depression standards at least. Corn was once the backbone of the rural American diet, and families knew how to make it work in just about every form imaginable. One of the most enduring and economical ways to stretch a bag of cornmeal was cornmeal mush with molasses. This dish, deceptively simple, was a staple on tables from Appalachia to the Midwest, especially during times when sugar was scarce and grocery lists were kept intentionally short. Cornmeal mush started with just 2 ingredients: cornmeal and water. Stirred over heat until thick and smooth, it could be poured into a pan to set, then sliced and fried the next day. But when served hot and fresh, a drizzle of molasses turned it into a breakfast or supper that offered comfort without cost. Molasses, often cheaper than refined sugar, added a deep sweetness, and more importantly, iron and minerals to a meal otherwise made from little. It was filling, adaptable, and incredibly frugal. Any leftovers could be reused, making it a true zero-waste option in kitchens where every scoop mattered. As one old saying went, mush in the morning meant no one went hungry by night. Though cornmeal mush with molasses has largely disappeared from modern mealtimes, it once stood as a symbol of how far a penny's worth of grain and a spoonful of syrup could carry a family. In homes where budgets were tight and second helpings weren't guaranteed, even stale bread got a second chance. One surprisingly common solution was fried bread and milk, a dish that turned pantry scraps into a warm, satisfying meal with minimal effort and almost no cost. If the bread was too tough to slice, that didn't matter. It just needed to hold together in the pan. The method was straightforward. Slices of day-old bread were fried in fat, usually bacon grease or lard, until golden and crisp, then served in a shallow bowl with warm milk poured over the top. For added flavor, a pinch of salt or sugar was sometimes sprinkled on, depending on whether it was served for breakfast or supper. Simple, yes, but in many homes, it was comfort food. This dish embodied Depression-era efficiency. It kept stale bread from going to waste and made use of milk before it turned sour. Fried in fat, the bread became rich and filling, stretching small portions into something substantial. While fried bread and milk might sound like a minimalist cousin of French toast, it was never about indulgence. Wartime rationing and economic downturns didn't leave much room for desserts filled with butter, eggs, and fresh milk. Yet families still found ways to enjoy a slice of something sweet without using a drop of the usual ingredients. Enter Eggless milkless spice cake, a recipe that became a household standard during both World Wars and the Great Depression. It didn't just skip the dairy and eggs, it skipped the fuss too. Built around shelf-stable pantry staples like flour, sugar, baking soda, vinegar, and spices, this cake relied on chemistry instead of luxury. The combination of vinegar and baking soda provided the rise, while cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg delivered the flavor. Raisins were often added when available, not for flair, but to add natural sweetness and moisture. It was commonly known as wacky cake or war cake, and for good reason. Despite the missing ingredients, it baked up moist and flavorful, proving that creativity in the kitchen didn't stop when the rations did. Some versions even used leftover coffee as the liquid base, giving the cake a depth that no one expected from such humble beginnings. In times when every scrap of food was valued, rural kitchens found innovative ways to combine simple ingredients into meals that warmed both body and spirit. Cottage cheese and potato dumplings emerged as a testament to ingenuity born of necessity, utilizing readily available cottage cheese and leftover potatoes to create a dish that was as economical as it was nourishing. Families would mix mashed potatoes with a modest amount of cottage cheese, a source of protein that could be stored without elaborate refrigeration, to form soft dumplings, which were then simmered in a light broth. This method not only maximized resources, but also ensured that nothing went to waste, a crucial principle during leaner times. Historically, cottage cheese was accessible and affordable, often made at home or sourced from local dairies, while potatoes were a staple crop in many backyards. These dumplings provided a filling meal that required little more than basic cooking techniques and a dash of salt and herbs. One might say that in an era of scarcity, even a modest dumpling had the audacity to defy hunger, proving that flavor and sustenance could flourish on a shoestring budget. At the tail end of harvest season, when frost threatened the garden and red tomatoes were still a few days off, resourceful cooks didn't panic. They picked what they had. That's when green tomato pie became a clever, last-ditch way to avoid waste and still put dessert on the table. Surprisingly sweet and often mistaken for apple pie, this dish turned unripened tomatoes into a spiced filling that mimicked fruit with uncanny success. Sliced green tomatoes were layered with sugar, cinnamon, and a touch of vinegar or lemon juice to balance the tang. Some versions added raisins or a bit of flour to thicken the filling, and the mixture was tucked between two pie crusts, just like any traditional fruit pie. It was frugal, yes, but also surprisingly flavorful, which made it a well-kept secret in rural households for generations. Not everyone knew what they were eating, and sometimes it was better that way. "Eat first, ask later," was a common refrain when guests took their first bite. With tomatoes too hard to slice for sandwiches and too green to can, this pie reduced garden waste and stretched dessert possibilities during tougher months. One of the most adaptable meals to come out of the mid-century American kitchen didn't start with a recipe. It started with whatever was left in the icebox. That's how poor man's casserole earned its name. A catch-all dinner built on affordability and survival smarts, it was designed less for presentation and more for practicality. If it could fit in a dish and bake without burning, it was fair game. This casserole usually began with a base of starch, leftover rice, elbow macaroni, or diced potatoes, followed by canned vegetables, a bit of protein, often ground beef or even hot dogs, and finished with a can of cream soup or a splash of milk to bind it all together. Cheese, when it made an appearance, was often the last stubborn shred in the fridge. The brilliance wasn't in the ingredients, it was in the concept. It kept grocery bills low, made use of bits and ends, and could be reheated throughout the week without complaint. Even when times were hard, this dish gave the illusion of plenty. While poor man's casserole might not impress a food critic, it helped families stretch a dollar farther than expected. It wasn't just a meal, it was a method, and in kitchens that prized thrift, it was often the week's MVP. Root vegetables were once the unsung heroes of the dinner table, especially when meat was scarce and grocery budgets ran thin. In that context, turnip and potato hash was a no-nonsense solution that brought together two of the cheapest and most accessible ingredients around. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable, and that counted for a lot when the pantry was down to the basics. Turnips, often overlooked today, were valued for their long shelf life and low cost. Paired with potatoes, another reliable staple, they formed the backbone of this skillet-fried hash. Cubed, boiled, and browned together with onions or leftover fat from breakfast, the mixture turned crisp at the edges and tender inside. It was seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever else was on hand, from garlic powder to a spoonful of drippings saved in a coffee can. This dish didn't rely on measurements or manuals. It relied on instinct and thrift. If you had a little leftover meat, it went in. If not, nobody blinked. The goal was always the same: stretch what you had and waste nothing. Though turnip and potato hash has quietly disappeared from most modern menus, it once represented a kind of culinary common sense. It made the most of the root cellar and filled bellies without draining wallets, a humble classic forged by necessity. In eras when sugar was precious and eggs were a luxury, resourceful cooks reached deep into the pantry and pulled out something unexpected: vinegar. That surprising staple gave rise to vinegar dumplings, a dessert born not out of abundance, but ingenuity. With no fruit on hand and pies out of reach, this simple recipe gave families a way to end a meal with something sweet, using the bare minimum. The dough was made with flour, baking powder, water, and a pinch of salt. Nothing fancy, just the basics. Dropped into a simmering syrup of water, sugar, butter, and vinegar, the dumplings cooked until tender, absorbing the tangy sweetness of the sauce. The vinegar added brightness and helped balance the sugary base, creating a complex flavor that felt surprisingly indulgent for such modest ingredients. This dish was often handed down from mother to daughter, more by demonstration than recipe. No one wrote it down. They just knew it by feel. A little more flour here, a splash less vinegar there. It was the kind of dessert that came together quickly and disappeared even faster. Though vinegar dumplings rarely show up on modern tables, they once stood as a reminder that dessert didn't need to be fancy. It just needed to be clever. Before lemons were regularly stocked in every grocery store, and long before bottled juice became a staple, resourceful cooks had to fake the flavor they craved. That's how mock lemon pie became a quiet legend in frugal kitchens across America. Devised during wartime shortages and Depression-era scrimping, this pie delivered the tang of citrus without a single lemon in sight. The trick was vinegar, mixed with sugar, water, a bit of flour or cornstarch, and a dash of butter. It created a filling that mimicked the sharp, sweet punch of lemon curd. A sprinkle of nutmeg or a touch of vanilla helped round out the illusion. Poured into a simple pie crust, often made with lard or shortening, it was baked until set and served with pride. This wasn't deception, it was adaptation. Lemons were expensive and hard to come by in inland or rural areas, especially in winter. Vinegar, on the other hand, was affordable, shelf-stable, and always on hand. As one cook put it, "It's not lemon, but it sure fooled the kids." Mock lemon pie wasn't a second-best option. It was a testament to making do without giving up flavor. When money was tight and protein was rationed, many households turned to broths and soups to stretch ingredients further than they were ever meant to go. Depression-era egg drop. Soup was one of those quietly brilliant solutions, a meal that could be made in minutes using little more than water, a bouillon cube, and a single egg. It was a dish where the egg wasn't the main attraction. It was the luxury swirl in an otherwise humble bowl. This version of egg drop soup didn't call for ginger, sesame oil, or scallions like the versions served in Chinese restaurants. Instead, it reflected the pantry of a 1930s American household. Simple broth made from scraps or cubes, sometimes thickened slightly with flour or cornstarch, and flavored with pepper or a dash of vinegar if anything else was around. The egg was beaten, then slowly drizzled in, forming silky ribbons the moment it hit the simmering liquid. For many, this was both starter and main course, light in ingredients, but filling enough to serve its purpose. The egg added vital protein, and the soup helped stretch limited groceries over one more day. Though Depression-era egg drop soup rarely appears in cookbooks today, it once offered warmth, nourishment, and a quiet reminder that even the simplest meals could bring comfort in uncertain times. There was a time when breakfast didn't come from a box and syrup wasn't a guaranteed guest at the table. In those years, resourceful cooks leaned on basics to build a morning meal, and water-fried pancakes were among the most stripped-down yet effective solutions. No milk, no eggs, just flour, water, and a pinch of salt, stirred into a thin batter and poured straight into a hot, greased skillet. It was born out of scarcity, not laziness. Milk and eggs were either too expensive or simply unavailable, particularly during the Great Depression and wartime rationing. But flour and water? Always on hand. The pancakes were crisp at the edges, slightly chewy in the center, and served with whatever sweetener or fat was nearby. Molasses, apple butter, or even just a swipe of lard. One old saying summed it up: if it sticks to the plate, it's breakfast. Not only did this dish stretch basic pantry items, but it also helped reduce food waste. Leftover batter could be fried again the next day, or thinned into a griddle cake. And in many homes, it doubled as a dinner side or snack. Baking during the Great Depression often meant mastering the art of illusion. When apples were out of season or out of budget, clever cooks turned to crackers. That's how Ritz mock apple pie earned its spot in culinary history. Believe it or not, this dessert looked and tasted shockingly like real apple pie, yet didn't contain a single piece of fruit. The secret was in science. Crushed Ritz crackers mimicked the texture of cooked apples once baked, while a syrup made from sugar, water, cream of tartar, and lemon juice created the sweet, tart flavor that made it all convincing. The crackers absorbed the liquid, softened, and, like magic, transformed into something that fooled more than a few dinner guests. Even the texture of the filling closely resembled tender apple slices. This recipe first appeared on the back of Ritz cracker boxes in the 1930s, a time when processed foods were starting to appear in American kitchens and innovation was born of need, not novelty. And in terms of reducing waste, it was a winner. No fruit to spoil, no peels to discard. While Ritz mock apple pie might puzzle younger generations today, it once stood as a prime example of Depression-era brilliance. A dessert made from pantry staples that could sweet-talk your taste buds into believing apples were never missing in the first place. In kitchens where dimes were stretched and grocery trips were rare, even the simplest ingredients had to serve double duty. That's where cabbage and bread soup proved its worth. A dish that combined two of the most affordable pantry staples into a meal that was both warming and filling, if not exactly flashy. When meat was missing and stock pots were light, this soup stepped in to do the heavy lifting. The method was modest but effective. Chopped cabbage simmered in water or weak broth, sometimes flavored with onion or garlic if available. Stale bread was cubed or torn and added in, acting as both thickener and sustenance. A drizzle of fat, bacon grease, butter, or lard might have been added for richness, but even without it, this soup got the job done. Cabbage was prized for its long shelf life and high yield per penny, while bread that had gone dry was never tossed. It was repurposed. Together, they made a dish that respected every scrap, every cent, and every ounce of effort. Long before flavored syrups lined grocery store shelves, families with tight budgets found simpler and cheaper ways to sweeten their milk. One of the most common was molasses milk, a straightforward mix of whole milk and a spoonful of blackstrap molasses. It wasn't just a drink. It was a dose of nutrition disguised as a treat, especially for kids growing up in rural America. Blackstrap molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, was affordable, shelf-stable, and rich in iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. That made it especially valuable during the Great Depression and wartime years, when vitamin supplements were a luxury few could afford. A splash of molasses in a glass of milk provided a quick energy boost and a touch of sweetness in an otherwise plain cup. In households where sugar was rationed or too expensive to use freely, molasses stepped in. And since both milk and molasses were commonly available on farms, it became an accessible comfort drink for many. Some versions were served warm in colder months, almost like a rustic cousin to hot cocoa, while others were stirred cold and gulped down at breakfast. Though molasses milk has quietly slipped out of modern rotation, it once stood as a practical answer to limited options, offering both nourishment and a bit of comfort at a time when both were in short supply. In a time when creativity was often the most abundant ingredient in the kitchen, home cooks weren't afraid to combine what they had, even if the pairing raised eyebrows. That's how peanut butter stuffed onions made their unusual debut. Strange as it sounds today, this Depression-era dish was a sincere attempt to turn two accessible ingredients into something hearty and protein-packed. Onions were cheap, easy to grow, and available year-round. Peanut butter, introduced widely to the American diet in the early 20th century, was affordable and loaded with protein and fat. Stuffing a hollowed-out onion with a spoonful of peanut butter, then baking it until tender, created a savory-sweet combo that was surprisingly filling. The natural sugars in the onion caramelized, while the peanut butter melted into a creamy, nutty core. This wasn't a novelty, it was survival cooking. Every bite was a small victory over an empty pantry. And while this dish never climbed the culinary ladder, it served a purpose, combining calories, nutrients, and comfort in one humble bulb. Though peanut butter stuffed onions might draw puzzled looks today, it once stood as a reminder of how necessity shaped the American plate. When flour ran low and leftovers had to earn their keep, thrift-minded cooks came up with clever ways to stretch ingredients without sacrificing flavor. Depression potato biscuits were one such invention, born not from abundance but from boiled spuds that might have otherwise gone to waste. In a time when nothing got tossed without a second thought, even leftover mashed potatoes found new life in the breadbasket. This biscuit used fewer ingredients than the standard version. Potatoes replaced a good portion of the flour, reducing reliance on wheat during times of shortage. Mixed with baking powder, a bit of fat, and salt, the dough baked up soft and tender, often with a slightly crisp edge if the pan was greased just right. They didn't rise as high as traditional biscuits, but they delivered on substance, and most importantly, they filled the stomach. For families with a sack of potatoes and not much else, these biscuits were a saving grace. They were often paired with gravy, soup, or just a pat of lard or butter if there was any to spare. In households where breakfast had to be hot, cheap, and made from whatever was left in the cupboard, one dish offered all three without complaint. Rice and raisin breakfast porridge was a go-to solution for stretching last night's dinner into tomorrow morning's start. Leftover rice, already cooked, already softened, was reheated with milk or water, a spoonful of sugar, and a handful of raisins for sweetness. It didn't require much, but it delivered just enough. Rice was a staple for a reason: affordable, filling, and shelf-stable. Combined with raisins, another budget-friendly ingredient that was kept for months, it created a nourishing bowl that fed both the body and the bottom line. Some families added cinnamon or a splash of canned milk when they had it, turning the porridge into something close to a treat. Others served it plain, warmed just enough to take the chill out of a cold morning. This was more than just a meal. It was a lesson in waste not thinking. Rather than tossing uneaten rice, it was repurposed into something new, satisfying, and comforting. The phrase mock crab salad sandwich might invoke images of cheap sandwiches that were built to just look like a crab sandwich, but if I've earned your trust at all so far, then keep an open mind, because this is actually a wonderful example of American ingenuity. So, mock food came out as a result of the Depression. Most people just couldn't really afford things like crab or red meat or any kind of meat, really. I mean, with the war rationing and everything, you pretty much had what you could hunt in the wild and the cheap cuts of meat that no one would really buy. Mock food was a way for people to get some flavors they were sorely missing. It stayed a long while even after the Depression, since thanks to urbanization, there were less and less coastal cities, bodies of water, and more. Otherwise, there used to be a time where crab was so abundant that it was cheap. Anyway, for this mock food imitation, what people would do is use cod or haddock instead, and the salad was just a basic mayo-celery mix with French or vinegar dressing. You'd lay that on some soft rolls, and you'd actually have a pretty good dish. The thing is, mock food culture is entirely a thing of the past now, and most of these recipes have been lost. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though. since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. Yes, you heard it here first, skunk stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. So, this next sandwich is also typically made from only 3 ingredients, but it's still one of Grandma's most iconic creations. I'm talking about the infamous BLT sandwich. The name is an abbreviation for the ingredients: bacon, lettuce, and tomato. This sandwich was a summertime favorite, especially when tomatoes were at their ripest in Graham's garden. The BLT's roots can be traced back to tea sandwiches served in the late 19th century, but it wasn't until World War II when it gained popularity. During this time, supermarkets made bacon, lettuce, and tomatoes more widely available all year round, and Grandma made sure to use them up in the kitchen. A classic BLT is often made with mayonnaise, but some purists argue that the sandwich should be spread with butter instead. Well, it's still up for debate, so make sure to let us know your take on it in the comments. Lettuce cups and shrimp salads were pretty funny. I mean, not exactly funny, but interesting. The assembly was something you would need skill for, though, which isn't at all similar to things like peanut butter and bacon sandwiches or corned beef and cabbage wraps. Leaves had to be carefully plucked from the head of the lettuce, and these would end up forming the shape of the cups. You would then spoon the cups with fillings, which were typically things like spices, vegetables, and stir-fried ground meat, but this instance of the dish has shrimp salad instead. Why was something like this popular? Well, besides a lot of influence from Asian culture, such as Thai and Chinese wraps, they were just easy. I mean, sure, you had to get used to making a lettuce cup, but that wasn't really the hardest thing to do. What was absolutely outstanding about these was the presentation. The sheer visual appeal that this dish had wasn't something you could ever compete with, honestly. I mean, a flowery-looking cup made out of lettuce leaves? That's artistic. Plus, the vibrant and colorful fillings inside would just make it pop off even more. As far as food goes, This one was definitely a slay. The once you did get one made, then you would simply have to prepare it by heating it up. They weren't really as good for lunch at work as they were for finger foods and a pretty-looking side or appetizer at a party, though. Cold pork pie was weird. It was supposed to be this British savory pastry that was probably the only dish best served cold after revenge, but I think it fell short on a lot of fronts. First, let's start with what constitutes a cold pork pie. This frigidly cold piece of British culture comes fully equipped with American favorites like lard, chopped or ground pork, nutmeg, mace, and lots of other stuffings. Plus, you know how people start experimenting with food and adding their own twists and turns wherever they can, no matter what. Who really sticks to tradition when you have like 5 different kinds of cheese to try? Anyway, while all of that sounds pretty good, fun, and a perfect environment for some serious brainstorming with what you can do with a pork pie, it was the savory jelly and cold aspect of it that kind of didn't stick too well. After the baking, you were supposed to pour a savory jelly made out of pork stock into the pie through a pretty tiny hole in the crust. Once the jelly would set and cool, it would enrich the flavor of the pie even more and help to preserve the meat as well. Pork pies were, for this reason, always served cold. However, America is a place that's really used to having their pork pies hot. And as you can probably tell, that's why you don't see bakeries, homes, or offices having cold pork pie days anymore. Forage mushrooms didn't always lining our burgers and topping our pizzas. For a majority of its history, it was really just something people ate when things were super bad. There was nothing to eat and people basically just had to forage for whatever they could. The most popular of this was the button mushroom, but they definitely tried to forage as much as they could. Now, despite this, mushrooms were still considered really low class. People had just begun to associate it with nothing but poverty and hard times. It wasn't until the middle and the later end of the 20th century that mushrooms started to become a classic topping you'd see on not just burgers and pizzas, but steaks, chicken dishes, sandwiches, and all kinds of soups and stews. Basically, it's a mushroom world, and we're just living in it now. A big part of this is how canned mushrooms became so accessible. Another reason is that an interest in European cuisine led to a massive boom in cream of soups and cream of mushroom soups. Share some of your favorite mushrooms with us right now in the comments. Blue crab was a really common and affordable food for a lot of coastal communities. It has become a sought-after item in places like Maryland and Louisiana and the Carolinas. But how did it get here? Blue crab was considered an everyday coastal food that was abundant among fish markets and fishermen. You would go take a walk along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and all you would ever see is a seemingly endless supply of blue crab that would never really go down either. For a lot of working-class families, this was a staple protein that was really helping them get through the day, while also making sure they were meeting their nutrition needs. Now, the labor process here was really hard. It took a lot to make blue crab, and cracking blue crabs to get the different kinds of meat was really time-consuming. It meant that they were less desirable for other consumers who basically would prefer lobster or oysters, especially the rich kind. They were really cheap and they weren't ever given away in fishing towns. People made use of everything they could, mostly because they were so available, you know? While you would think that would mean that people would essentially always sell the excess fish, they would actually just stock up on it for winters and consume it. Blue crab started to become expensive thanks to the rise of commercial fishing and a lot of environmental work that had risen in the Chesapeake Bay. Blue crab populations were starting to decline really sharply, and it became a thing of national concern. That and the high labor cost meant that blue crab was starting to get really pricey. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies. And this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Macaroni salad with ham cubes is a really nostalgic one. If you look at it from the lens of what was popular in the era at the time, then yeah, sure, macaroni salads were a perfect middle ground between healthier, leaner bowls of salads and the typical macaroni and cheese meals we were all used to. People thought they had to get started somewhere, and well, why not get it going with something you know you can stand? If you look at it historically, then macaroni salad actually goes all the way back to European dishes like pasta fredda, and in the early 20th century, let's say around the 20s and 30s, it was a really popular meal to have as a side dish. During the Depression, it became a staple because you could make so much of it in large batches and still get everyone fed and taken care of. Now, in the war era, the rise of convenience foods meant that mayonnaise and macaroni were getting even more popular and accessible than ever before. It was only natural that people would start adopting macaroni salads, but they needed something to go with it. Some oomph, you know? That definitely came from the smokiness of the ham cubes, which honestly bounced really well off of the macaroni. This salad was a typical lunch in factories, offices, and just about any kind of labor-intensive job you could imagine. It's just a bit sad that people have gone back to Kraft's mac and cheese boxes now, though. Octopus is actually one I bet you've never really heard about before. Octopus used to be considered a food that was pretty much a last resort. It was something that coastal peasants and fishermen ate when they had literally nothing else. It started to turn into a delicacy thanks to Japanese sushi and Italian seafood dishes. But man, it was really underrated. Octopus was considered super difficult to cook. You had to either dry it, or pound it, or slow simmer it, and it was really rubbery. The texture was foreign to a lot of people, so that's why they only ate it when there was nothing else. And naturally, if that's all you do, then that's the association you build. It became synonymous with bad times. It wasn't until lots of restaurants started doing things like pulpo a la gallega, which is a popular Spanish dish, and things like takoyaki and reductions that octopus started to gain respect in gourmet circles. Polenta has pretty much always been considered gruel food. It's made from boiled cornmeal and is something even Italian immigrants and Italian Americans consider to be a low-status dish. It was a recipe that was born out of necessity, but recently, lots of high-end restaurants and chefs have embraced it and appreciated it for how creamy it is and the versatility of the overall recipe. In the 1900s, most people were moving away from polenta because they were just more fond of bread and pasta. They were considered simpler, cleaner, and just overall more nice. Lots of Italians also shared the opinion, so there was really no one in polenta's corner. Until the middle of the 1900s. Sometimes you pull yourself out of your own rut, and that's what polenta did. The middle of the 20th century was a time marked by a lot of things, one of them being tourism, and one of the top countries for it was Italy. So many Italicans were visiting, and polenta, capitalizing on that via lots of high-end chefs reinventing it, serving it with things eel truffle oil and seafood, became a bit of a regional specialty. If we take a small intermission from the dessert side of things and step on over to some hearty, comforting, and homely soups, we'll find a golden recipe lost among the cookbooks of the 20th century that don't get to see the light of day anymore. Pea and ham soup got its name because of how affordable it was. This is probably the cheapest thing on the list to make. Actually, it literally costs just a few cents. All you needed was ham and peas. You'd simmer them in the crock pot with diced ham and some vegetables like potatoes and celery, then slow cook it until the soup got thickened. You'd get this incredibly creamy, lovely soup that was just perfect for winter nights or after a long, exhausting weekend. Maybe you want to ease up on your stomach and eat something healthy for a change, but you still want some familiar flavors to keep you company. A soup like this would be right up your alley. It costs nothing, feels better than most things, and you can make it anytime. You could probably even take a nap and wake up to the scent of the soup slowly cooking, becoming the final product. Also, the key to a good sandwich was in its simple ingredients, and Graham knew it better than anyone. That's why she whipped up the classic chicken salad sandwich anytime we craved some comfort food. Chicken salad has been a beloved dish in American homes since the mid-1800s. Grandma decided to make it into a hearty sandwich to make snack time better. Grandma's version of the chicken salad sandwich often included unique ingredients passed down through generations. Depending on where your grandma hails from, her chicken salad sandwich recipe might have a regional flair. In the South, you might find it spiced with a bit of mustard or pickle juice, while in New England, cranberries might be tossed in for a touch of tartness. Chicken a la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. Nothing left but the basics. Survival meals had to be simple. Grits and water was about as bare bones as it got. No butter, no milk, just ground corn simmered in water until it thickened into something edible. Grits had long been a staple in the South, where corn was abundant and cheap. Normally, they were cooked with milk or broth for flavor, but when times were hard, even those additions were a luxury. Water had to do. A pinch of salt, if available, might cut the blandness. Some families thinned them out to make the pot last longer, while others let them cook down into a thicker porridge for a more filling meal. There was ingenuity behind this dish. Grits were not only affordable, but they expanded when cooked, making a little go a long way. Leftovers weren't wasted either. Cooled and hardened grits could be sliced and fried the next day, turning yesterday's meal into something with a bit of crunch. For many, grits and water was a meal born out of necessity, but it carried meaning beyond hunger. It was a reminder of resilience, of stretching every ingredient, of doing what had to be done. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane, where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. If you've ever walked the streets of downtown New York, I'm sure you're familiar with the infamous pastrami on rye. If your grandma's from the Big Apple, chances are her recipe is highly regarded. This sandwich became a staple in Jewish delis in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thanks to Eastern European immigrants. This one just featured an old-fashioned slice of pastrami on rye bread and a dollop of mustard. Grandma knew that when it came to sandwiches, sometimes less is more, and pastrami on rye is the perfect example of that. But hey, don't forget no pastrami on rye is complete without a pickle on the side. The tartness of a dill pickle or the sweetness of a bread and butter pickle is the perfect contrast to the savory pastrami. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Handmade butter used to be a really simple kitchen staple at home, and it started to be reborn as a gourmet product when people really got into the crafts and works aspect of it. See, people like things they made on their own. It gives them a chance to show off on Instagram, it gives them something to talk about with their friends, or it just becomes something cool to speak about on a date. You know, a cute and quirky little fact about yourself that helps break the ice. Besides that, there's also the authenticity and uniqueness of a completely 100% homegrown and homemade product. In a world full of preservatives, food dyes, artificial flavorings, and added vitamins and minerals, something that's actually just made out of the stuff God put on Earth and nothing else is a relief. The revival of artisanal butter throughout the 2000s to today was really helpful in giving it a new image. High-end restaurants started serving cultured butters, and they even started putting hand-churned ones up for sale. There was a premium price you had to pay, but man, the suburban moms fell for it so bad. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to let us know your favorite dish from the list, and don't forget to like and subscribe.